Monotype.
Welcome to Creative Characters from Monotype, a show where we meet the people working at the intersection of type and everyday life. I'm your host, Bill, and I'm here with my good friend, Cadley. Hi, Cadley.
Hi, Bill. How are you?
I'm doing very well. It's always quite a joy when I get to host an episode with you. I love following all of your adventures, and you were telling me a little bit about the latest place that you got to visit and experience.
Yes, I was just on vacation in Santa Barbara, California. Did some wine tasting, saw a whale, saw some dolphins, went in some caves. So yeah, it was a really nice summery trip and a good little escape from hot Colorado.
Yeah, there's a lot of art and creativity in that part of California, a lot of writers and designers and the like. And it was also kind of a nice connection to today's Creative Characters guest because he also is an artist from Southern California. And I know you were excited to bring him on and interview him. So maybe you could tell everybody a little bit about today's guest.
So this week's guest is Erwin Hines. He's an artist and creative who is based in San Diego in California in the Barrio Logan district. So I think his story is really interesting because he grew up in Cleveland, Ohio, to two parents who owned a development company, and they were focused on urban planning. So he was really inspired by the work that his parents were doing to create space for people. And that's essentially what he's doing now with his own brand, Future is Color, building and holding space for people. So especially space within the community in Barrio Logan in San Diego. So he hosts free events, everything from like jazz nights to art nights, and the surrounding businesses are excited to have someone who's, fostering community and bringing people in. So I think that it's a really interesting, crossover between like branding and design and then like in-person events that are really focused on like actual genuine human connection, which is really refreshing.
Yeah, it's one of my favorite concepts is the idea of art space placemaking, which is something I really love, where towns or communities will intentionally bring artists into areas to revitalize, to help educate, to help kind of reimagine public spaces. And I don't know that that's exactly what, Erwin's doing, but the outcome is probably the same, where you're educating the population, you're inspiring them, and then you're also kind of bringing together all sorts of other businesses and individuals for unexpected outcomes that are probably very, very fun and interesting, and as you said, refreshing. So that's a great story. It kind of brings design into the public sphere too, which we always love, and into community. And so I'm really glad that we were able to get him. And without further ado, I will turn it back over to you, Cadley, and to Erwin, this week's creative character.
Hey, Erwin, thanks so much for coming on the podcast today.
Oh, thank you for having me. I'm super excited. My name is Erwin Hines. I am an artist, designer, sometimes creative director. And I always say sometimes creative director because it's really dependent on the project and it doesn't necessarily define my identity. I would say something that definitely defines my identity is the fact that I'm an artist in sort of any space that I play in from a creative standpoint. I'm based in San Diego, currently in my creative studio / retail space in the very vibrant Barrio Logan. Space holds a really close space in my heart, mainly because Barrio Logan, when I first came to San Diego, was the neighborhood that really introduced me to sort of like a cultural texture of San Diego. And I felt at home in Barrio Logan.
And Erwin, you run your own brand, right?
Yeah, I run a brand called Future is Color. It is a streetwear brand, but for me, it's more than that. So the mission of the brand is to create accessible space for conversation and dialogue, really centered on collective liberation. And so we have clothes at the top of the sort of funnel that promote that outwardly. And a lot of the clothing has a lot of copy on it to help communicate that message. But then we also do different experiences to really add a tangible space to actually hold space for conversation, because part of collective liberation and part of that process of empathy building is not only dialogue and conversation, but it's also sort of proximity and bringing people together. So the brand sort of operates on both those fronts.
I was just going to say, the way you described your connection to the space and the neighborhood that you're in is interesting, because what I first wanted to talk about was just your upbringing. I know that you're from Cleveland and that both of your parents worked in urban planning.
Yeah, so they owned a development company together.
Okay.
So they definitely, both of them did it.
And I know that kind of influenced your initial interest in the creative space, and then you kind of took your own path. So can you just tell me a little bit about that?
I guess my journey to get to where I am now is an interesting one, and it's something that I oftentimes think on, right? So when I first started Future is Color, I took a moment to really sort of like journal and really trace back the lineage of creativity, community engagement, and impact that I saw with my family. Maybe it was like to justify what I'm doing and to justify sort of leaving the agency space and taking that risk to say, like, this is really what I'm supposed to be doing. But growing up in Cleveland, my parents took me to work with them every single weekend. So I never really had a weekend when I was young. We didn't have summer when I was young. And obviously that teaches you a lot of responsibility. But when I was a kid, I was like, I want summer. I want to like hang out with my friends. So I didn't know what was being like imparted into me during that process. And then by the time I got into high school and was trying to decide what I wanted to do with my life and what I wanted to do in college, I then began to maybe put two and two together. I began to see the larger impact that my parents were having within these communities because they were building affordable housing. And all the time when you build affordable housing, you just get money from the government to maybe hire people that are fresh out of prison, as well as to build these properties, but you don't necessarily build them in a way that's going to sustain and last. And so what they were doing, when they were building these affordable housing, they were hiring people who were fresh out of prison to give opportunity. But then we would go back down to these neighborhoods to check up on people, right? And to check up on the neighborhood to make sure they had everything they needed. And along with my parents owning the development company, my grandparents on one side also owned a landscaping company. And then my grandparents on the other side owned an exterminating company. And so with that, they created like an ecosystem of caring for these communities so that they can continue to learn how to maintain their home in a proper way and really understand how to build equity, not only in their own communities, but really when you begin to think about what that does for yourself and your self-esteem, when the place you live in is cared for and people show you that they care, that just builds a sense of like deeper self-worth.
Yeah, I love that term, ecosystem of caring. And what you said about it is so true. When and how did that start to influence your creative path?
When I really began to see that as a senior in high school, I was like, oh, I have to do architecture. I have to do urban planning. I have to go into this space. Even though I was like doing creative stuff and I was like making clothes, I was doing art and all that stuff, I didn't see that as like a pathway to like professionalism or success. And because what was painted for me as like a successful pathway was sort of this urban planning, urban development, and my way of being artistic in that space was going to be architecture with a leaning on like, okay, how do I take that knowledge and build space and build place for people and really create an opportunity for serendipitous connections. And so for me, when I would like launch Future is Color and I was like trying to trace back like what made me want to do this, there was just a deep resonance with me that what I'm doing has affirmation in what was instilled into me as a kid. Right? Because for me, the whole idea of creating space for conversation and dialogue and empathy building is still rooted in this knowledge and notion of urban planning.
I remember you mentioning that when you started to study architecture, you kind of noticed that it was tough to like push change really quickly in that space. And that Basquiat sort of like was kind of on the opposite end of that spectrum where he, was able to push change really fast. So when did the transition from architecture to design happen and how did that happen for you?
So when I went to school my first year, I was studying architecture. And as I began to like dig into it, and again, this is probably like youthful impatience with the actual process and not wanting to submit to the process and submit to the authorities. I was in architecture, and when taking architecture, you also take an art history class. And I had never taken art history in my life, ever. And while I was taking the art history class, there was a strong contrast between sort of like the time it takes to have impact as an architect and the process of having impact as an architect and all of the sort of rules and regulations you have to follow as an architect. And again, I'm young. I'm like, I don't want to follow any rules and regulations. I just want to do stuff. And then when I begin to learn about fine artists, and especially someone like Basquiat, who I'm sure a lot of like young Black artists who are just like finding art can begin to relate to because it's someone who looks like us and somebody who presents like us and somebody who shows up like us. When I saw Basquiat and what he was doing and how he had impact, and for me, what I took from his sort of life and what he did in sort of the art world was the same as what I saw my parents doing within the urban planning world, which was essentially using art and influence to create space for people who look like him within these high art spaces, right? In high art places, right? Like he was an artist who did stuff in the streets. He did graffiti, but he was able to bridge that gap from graffiti and street art into the high art spaces and create more opportunity for young Black artists or BIPOC artists. And so as soon as I saw that, I was like, you know what? Forget architecture. I'm going to pursue fine art. So then I actually like dropped out of school after my first year, took some time to really find out who I was and what I wanted to do. And since I thought I wanted to be an artist, I'm like, hey, I got to go live in New York, obviously. So then I went to just a couch surf with some friends who were at NYU. And then all the time I was still like doing a little bit of art here and there. I was like dabbling. I think I told you I tried to make music because I was like, maybe I'll be a musician. Obviously, I can do this. And no one wanted to buy any of my mixtapes or even wanted them for free. But what they were buying was like some of the clothes I would make. So I would do like some cut and sew pants, or I would just take old Levi's and like cut them up and then remake them, or maybe make jerseys into pants, or do like custom sneakers. And people wanted those, but no one wanted the music. And for some reason, I was super heavy on like, I can be this musician. I can do this. And it was just one of my friends who was like, no, you should really pursue art in some way, shape, or form. And I still didn't really know what that meant at that time.
And so then what happened?
And then I started dating someone who went to the Wharton Business School. And so I went from living on couches in NYU, trying to pursue music and sort of dabbling in art and somebody telling me I should pursue art, to then basically like couch surfing in Philadelphia and then auditing some classes at the Wharton Business School. And then one of the classes just happened to be a brand class, and they were going over a case study. And I forgot who the case study was for, but in that class, things began to click. Once I figured out about what branding is, and the fact that branding is about creating these worlds that don't exist just physically, but really exist in the mind's eye, and how we connect these larger narratives and stories, and how many people connect with one single narrative and one single story, and how all these individuals are now brought together through that. So for me, branding became this pathway almost back to urban planning, back to the impact that I saw with Basquiat, in a way to actually have deep impact in this world. Then I went back to school at the Art Institute of Pittsburgh with a particular focus on how can I do like branding, how can I do design. So it was, again, this whole roundabout sort of like pathway of getting into the design world. But this same like line has always been there of like, how do I actually have deeper impact? Can I bring people together? And how can I create space, overarching space for disparate groups to interact with one another?
Next, I wanted to talk about serendipity. This is something, so I remember last time we spoke, you talked about how like you never really planned to be in San Diego. You never really planned to work at Basic Agency. And what you were just describing is another very serendipitous situation where your partner in college ended up maybe launching you down a different path than you had previously seen. So can you just tell me a little bit about like how serendipity has played a role in your creative life?
I feel like serendipity has just been the whole thing, honestly. I think one of the funny things, about my whole journey, because people always ask, like, how did you do this? Or what do you need to do X, Y, and Z? And then even though I've been able to sort of like trace back key milestones, I think one also consistent thing is there was nothing ever planned. And I think that also comes into more prevalence now when people are asking me, like, what's your 5-year plan for Future is Color? I'm like, look, I don't know, because I've never had a plan for any of this sort of creative life. And I've been able to make it this far. And not to say that you shouldn't have plans, but for me, I really lean sort of like into serendipity and just allowing things to happen. And so even when I look at like that trajectory within university of like, I did choose architecture, but then I like got interested in fine art. And then I just allowed that to sort of like guide me to go to New York. And then I allowed that journey to then guide me to go to Philadelphia and live in Philadelphia for a little bit. And this was all against my parents' better judgment and like wishes. Like they were like, please just come home. You can work for the company. You can get your license to drive a dump truck, and you can drive that dump truck, and it's a stable job. you'll be taken care of, and then you can work your way up within our company. And I was like, absolutely not. I'm just going to choose living on couches because it's exciting and I feel joy. But there was no real plan. And then even my decision to come to California was really me following my then sort of like college girlfriend. When I was in college and I was thinking about where do I want to go after college, it was never California. It was like, I want to go to New York. And that's where I wanted to be because that's where all the agencies that I loved were. And that's where the coolest energy was for a young creative. So I wanted to go back. But then again, it was choosing love was more exciting. And I don't know if that's because I was like raised with a bunch of rom-coms and I love rom-coms. And there's always like serendipity that happens in rom-coms where the things that just happen are the things that should happen to us and should happen for us. And I feel like ultimately it did play out to deliver the things that apparently were supposed to happen, to follow love out to California. And it wasn't even like the cool parts of California. It was Anaheim. Not that Anaheim is horrible, but it's not what you think about when you're like from the Midwest or from the East Coast of California.
Oh, Anaheim. So how did you find your way down to San Diego then?
And then I just happened to get an opportunity offered down in San Diego. And then I ended up taking it. And then as I was working as a designer in like the professional setting in an agency, there was people who would ask like, oh, what do you want to be as a designer? What do you want to do? What do you want to do? And I never had an answer because I just enjoyed the act of creating as a process of like continued learning. For me, once I found design, that's also when I began to really fall in love with education because it was a way for me as someone with ADD to slow down my brain because I actually had a tangible output or tangible thing that I was going to create with this knowledge that I was now receiving. Before design, I feel like I was always everywhere. I was like, I don't know what I'm actually going to do with this information that you're trying to teach me. I don't have anywhere to put it. I don't have anything to do with it. And so for me, that's just been the joy of creativity and design outside of the whole creating space and creating place and placemaking. The inner joy has just been learning and education. And so there was never a professional desire to win awards. There was never a professional desire to work with the Nikes, the Googles at all. But all of that ended up happening for me because I was so focused on using design as a process of education. And then through that, I began to develop my own theory of how design should show up in this world and how design can actually help people. And so I think for me, the whole process of success in my space has not been chasing sort of the capitalistic structure of success or what is perceived as outward success, right? It's been chasing more knowledge and chasing self-growth through the act of creating.
I think that all of those things can be like really tough for a lot of people, myself included. Like, so it sounds like you've had this, I don't know if it's like a trust in yourself, but like just allowing your life to kind of take this path. Is there any advice you could give people? Or is this just something you have to do as you grow into the human being that you are?
I think it's something I struggle with more and more now as I obviously have more responsibilities, especially as an entrepreneur, and have now like, oh, it would be nice to own a house. It would be nice to do all these things. So I think I always have to continuously remind myself that I got this far by not worrying about any of those things, but more so, again, worrying about what brings me joy. And I think I use the word joy instead of happiness or just like surface pleasure, because joy to me is something that's deeper. Joy to me is something that's lasting, and joy comes from a deeper knowledge of who you are. But I would say like my one thing that I now again intentionally do is like wake up and ask what brings me joy and how can I continue to pursue that, and all things be for that end as opposed to be for the end of making money. And I think that even goes for something like some of our ancillary like programs, like with Future is Color. I could not have this retail space and be making more money. And I could do a whole drop shipping model where I never touch the clothes. I never see the clothes. It just gets all shipped through the warehouse that I print at. Way more profitable. But it would then also remove the opportunity for me to have space and hold space for the community. It would have never given birth to something like studio sessions or our jazz nights. And now with those, we host around like 150 people every single week. And people come, and when they leave, we've heard that they feel like a sense of like being seen and feeling seen in a city that they didn't feel seen in before. They feel a sense of home. They feel a sense of family. And again, that's something that I could like look at that and go like, okay, how do I now turn this into profit? Maybe I can just charge $5. It's not that much. People can still get in. It's still accessible. But for me, the goal is not profit with it. The goal is maybe like internal wealth and using it as a space to help build empathy. And then even in doing that, now with our jazz nights, we're on the end of Barrio Logan. So there's like two sides of Barrio Logan, not a good and bad side, but there's two sides of the block, right? Like it's a long street. On our side of the block, there really wasn't a lot of activity. There wasn't a lot of people coming in the evening to hang out. And the only thing that was really open was like bars. And so younger people had nowhere to hang out, which is not necessarily the best thing if a bunch of young people don't have a space to hang out. And then, yeah, you can have like nonprofits, but oftentimes nonprofits aren't perceived as cool. So kids aren't going to go hang out at a community center. And so the reason we really introduced studio sessions was to be free, accessible space to gather and provide, again, that thing that was missing and then co-create it with the community. And then now neighbors stay open later on Thursdays and get like 500% increase on revenue for them. So no one's buying anything at my store at all. Really, we don't really get that many sales, but the neighbors get sales. And for me, I get so much more joy out of that. And so I guess that all goes back to the original question of what advice to be able to really like follow that inner sense and how do you continue to check with the inner sense. I think it's as we continue to intentionally divert our attention away from the capitalistic gains and capitalistic goals and goals of being more productive within a system, then we can really find what brings us internal joy. And I would venture to say that most of what brings us internal joy has something to do with how we can show up for community with the gifts that we've been given.
It's beautiful. Okay, so to pivot a little bit, so like I know a few weeks ago you launched a collection for or with Foot Locker. Walk me through how that sort of project happens, like I guess how it still feeds your joy.
Yeah, I would say like, even though I stepped out of the agency space, I would say that my body of work now falls underneath my mission to sort of self-actualize and self-reflect and put something out into the world that's going to ultimately drive that larger vision and that larger mission of Future is Color, which again is to create accessible space for conversation and dialogue, focus on collective liberation. And we do that through both garments and clothing and then physical experiences. That being said, I do some consulting work still with different projects. So right now I'm actually partnering with an agency called Studio Tomo on a project for a nonprofit named Village of Wisdom. But the work Village of Wisdom does is deeply focused on centering the Black experience and creating a space for collective liberation for Black families. And so that work directly aligns with the work that I'm doing through my own brand, Future is Color. Or at the end of last year, I worked with the Academy Awards Museum to create a digital experience for the Regeneration exhibition, which was tracing the history of Black cinema, and just with that main statement of we've been there creating and helping to shape cinema since the beginning. Each of these projects really, for me, are research projects. So I'm using the sort of end goal of like, I'm going to create these garments or I'm going to create this thing. I'm using that as like an excuse to just do deep research and sort of like find and uncover all of these like moments throughout history, and then just articulating it through either a digital platform or physical experience or garment, right? And so I would say I don't necessarily view most things now as client relationships. I would say that all of them sort of are artistic projects in the same way artists and fine artists and painters have donors and sponsors and people who are supporting their work. I think that's how I take on clients or take on projects now, right? Where it's like, is this going to be deeply aligned with something that I'm already exploring within the ecosystem of Future is Color, which I would almost say Foot Locker is really just a partnership where they are distributing my clothing, right? That's like further and further from client relationship and more of like a partnership where they are helping to support young, small businesses by using their larger network to help push the brands. And for me, that relationship has been really beneficial, not from the standpoint of like me having clothes and more stores, but really from a standpoint of like learning more about the fashion industry. Because up until I got the partnership with Foot Locker, I was just like shooting in the dark. Me getting into the fashion industry is a whole line of the serendipity. Working as a creative director at Basic, a really amazing agency. We were working with clients like Google, Beats by Dre. We helped relaunch Wilson. I never thought that I would leave that to make shirts. And it was just like me making a shirt because I was trying to heal through the process of the murder of George Floyd. That Features Color was birthed. And then with the Foot Locker partnership, I was able to actually dive deeper into the manufacturing process and learn how to truly make clothes from scratch and not just using other existing blanks, and begin to make things that have a particular texture, have a particular fabric, but also not make it like hyper expensive, still make it accessible.
Okay, so can you just like explain to me your brand and kind of how all the different moving parts work together as a way to engage your community?
I would say Futures Color is an ecosystem. And on the top level of that, we have like the clothes. And so the clothes are almost like acting like protests. And within every single movement and sort of revolution throughout history, you have protests that is like the awareness portion. So that raises awareness, that creates like the inability for us to all ignore what's happening. So it's the outward sort of promotion, but then you also have to have the back end work in order to create real change. So for me, there was an importance of having these deeper layers of like opportunities to engage with these messages. So then we introduced Good Friends. Good Friends is a physical dinner series that takes those same messages that we're actually exploring through sort of the top level clothing line, and then putting them into a physical space where we invite 12 people together. None of these 12 people know each other. We make sure of that. You don't have a plus one. So there's this sense of discomfort. And then each of the dinners is curated around a particular theme. And so those themes are ranging from notions of joy to love to legacy. But it's all about flipping those to say, like, joy, yes, but how do we separate our idea from joy from sort of the joy that's been presented to us through capitalism? And the same thing with love. And so creating those physical spaces just creates a lasting and deeper connection with those actual themes, as well as truly builds empathy, because you need proximity in order to actually build empathy between disparate groups of people. And then on top of that, we have studio sessions, which is using music to do the same thing. So those obviously host a larger group of people, but it's intentionally curating different genres such as jazz or Chicago house music that have these deeper narratives and stories behind them, and bringing people into a space where they can learn about that. And then also intentionally having like small breaks where you can actually have conversation. And I think one of the special things that has happened with the brand Futures Color overall is that it's because of the messaging and because of what it stands for, it's attracted a very diverse group of individuals. So even in our jazz nights, we'll have like the scene kids, we'll have the club kids, we'll have like older couples from like North County that never come down to like Barrio Logan. We have the young people, we have whole families, we have a bunch of people that would never interact. And so to me, these are like the physical embodiments of that top line message of how do we break down the barriers between that artificially divide us and begin to actually like come together to create more empathy.
One of the things that you said at Brand New when I saw you speak was that brands have an opportunity to affect community on a deep level. And I feel like that's obviously part of your mission. We talked about just a little bit about how like bigger capitalist, brands aren't always necessarily able to do that. So I guess just like, can you go a little bit into more detail about how they can?
Yeah, I was like, I have a perspective, and I don't necessarily know if it's how they can, but I think it's more of like a critical eye that I hope that organizations would really begin to look at. Because I think we even saw it with like how fast people jumped on BLM and how fast they implemented programs, but then how quickly or maybe slowly they realized that it's not easy to actually act on what they said they would do. And then a lot of people got rid of their programs, or a lot of people like basically shuttered those programs, right? When organizations are looking to have impact and deep impact within community, I think there's a deep need to realize that it's not always going to be for the best interests of the shareholders. It's not always going to be profitable, but I feel like it's important for these organizations to use the power that they have. A lot of these organizations have lobbying power. They can either save land. I mean, like King did that and Patagonia did that. So it's like using their money and using their power to save something. I just think more organizations can do that because they have way more money than I do. And I'm like a small business, small brand. And it's like, I'm able to see how one jazz night can feed like 5 different other small businesses and help to build a sense of community and help people feel seen. And I think in order to do that, again, it's about moving into communities in a way where you're not trying to sell product. You're not saying you have to buy this product in order to be a part of this community. You're saying we sell product, we're good. What we're going to bring to your community is the thing that your community needs. Help us create that. How can we do that? How can we help you? It's inviting people in to help co-create the thing that the community needs. And I feel like oftentimes the community does not need another product. And I think for me, that was something actively that I would tell people when they come in. The reason we're holding community space, the reason we're doing open co-working space for free, you can come into the studio and use our photography equipment for free. Because at the end of the day, I know that this community does not need another $50 shirt or does not need a $50 t-shirt at all. We can use Foot Locker for that partnership to sell the $50 t-shirts. But what this community needs is space to gather.
When you look at big organizations and big brands and big companies, like I'm sure you've witnessed sometimes the amount of time it takes to do the simplest things and how they don't get out of their own way. So that was just like, that's also probably another part of it.
Oh, yeah.
Going beyond like just wanting to sell $50 t-shirts or whatever, like being scared to do something where they're not making a profit. I think that the timelines, maybe they're not always as focused on like just getting shit done quickly.
Yeah, and I was like, I feel like that's something we talked about before, of like why I was so inspired by Basquiat was that architecture takes a really long time to have impact unless you're some like golden child and you get to like design a building super young. And again, even if this wasn't the reality, it was sort of the idealized reality that was framed in my head as a creative when I was like, ooh, an artist's life is cool. And I saw Basquiat. To me, there was like a jolt to the system that he had, and he used culture and art to sort of jolt the system. And then institutions had to pay attention. And because institutions were paying attention and money was flowing into his art, then corporations began to pay attention and they had to shift. So to me, everything will move as normal until there's a jolt to the system, and that jolt to the system can shift everything, right? And cause us to sort of like take a moment of pause and really think about what we're doing. And then, yes, everything flows based on like capitalism, and we live in a capitalistic society. But I think those small jolts to the system can help shift us in the right direction. And I think for me, whoever was listening to this, it's always like, until you feel that internal tension. And when you feel that internal tension, that's the universe or whatever telling you to like pursue that thing. And then when you pursue that thing, you might actually jolt the system to actually change the entirety of the system for the better. And I feel like we've seen that over the past like couple of years as people sort of like, what is it? The Great Resignation, where a lot of people quit their jobs. There was a lot of people who started things that jolted the system. And now they're working with the largest brands in the world in order to help those brands follow that new rise and energy around liberation or BIPOC sort of art and voices within these different spaces.
Well, I'm really excited to come check out the space someday soon, and I urge all of our listeners to also stop by.
Again, it's in Barrio Logan, the most culturally rich neighborhood in San Diego, where I got introduced to art in San Diego. It's 2060 Logan Avenue. We're open from like Tuesday to Saturday from 11 PST to 4:30 PST. And then, we actually just introduced Tuesday evening events as well. So we have a producer night where we have 3 producers every Tuesday come in. We provide them with a crate of records, and then they have to live flip beats in like a 3-hour period. So we have a lot of different music events too, if people ever are in San Diego.
Cool. Thanks, Erwin. I really appreciate you coming on the podcast today and sharing your story. I'm really excited for all our listeners to hear it.
No, thank you for having me. It honestly was a pleasure having this conversation.
Thanks for listening. You can check out Erwin's work at erwin-hines.com, ERWIN-HINES.com. As always, look for a link to our blog post in the show notes of this episode, and check out monotype.com/podcast to read about all of our prior guests. If you've been enjoying our podcast, please go to Apple Podcasts or Spotify to rate and review this episode. And if you really like us, subscribe to the show and share us with your friends. Creative Characters is brought to you by Monotype. It is produced by Christopher Olin, Mia Sullivan, and Marie Tabares. We will be back with more episodes soon. Take care, everybody.